The evening sky was painted with soft shades of orange and gold as people gathered outside the grand concert hall. Elegant cars lined the street and flashes from cameras lit up the marble steps. It was one of those nights when everything seemed to shimmer, the kind of night that made people dress their best and smile as though the world revolved around them. Inside, the air buzzed with excitement. Guests chatted in low voices, holding tickets that bore the name of the event, the Winter Piano Gala. It was the city's most anticipated recital, a night reserved for the best pianists, critics, and lovers of classical music. Amid the crowd, a modest woman entered quietly through the side doors. She wasn't surrounded by photographers or fans. She didn't wear expensive perfume or glittering jewelry. Her dress was plain, a soft beige color that looked simple but neat. Her shoes were a little worn at the edges, and she carried an old leather bag over her shoulder. She moved carefully as if she didn't want to disturb anyone. No one noticed her at first. People were too busy greeting one another, taking photos and discussing which famous pianist would perform first. A group of young musicians stood nearby, laughing and adjusting their bow ties. One of them glanced at the woman as she passed by and then looked away without much thought. She stopped near the registration desk where a young assistant looked up from his clipboard. "Yes?" he asked, glancing at her. "I'm here for the recital," she said softly. The assistant looked confused for a moment. "As a guest or performer?" "As a performer," she replied, handing him her small folded paper invitation. He blinked and quickly checked the list. Her name was indeed there, written in neat handwriting, the last one on the program. "Oh, right," he said, clearing his throat. "You're scheduled last." "Thank you," she said gently. The assistant nodded but didn't say more. As she walked past him, he turned to his colleague and whispered something under his breath. They both looked at her, puzzled. She didn't notice, or maybe she chose not to. The woman took a seat in the back row while the audience continued to fill the hall. From her seat, she could see the grand piano shining under the lights on stage. It was a beautiful instrument, black, polished, and elegant. She stared at it quietly, her eyes soft with admiration. A group of elegantly dressed women sat nearby, chatting in excitement. One of them noticed the modest woman sitting alone and whispered, "Do you think she's someone's relative?" "Probably," another replied with a slight shrug. "She doesn't look like one of the performers." The woman smiled faintly to herself as she overheard them. She wasn't angry. She was used to such comments. People often made assumptions when they saw her quiet presence and simple clothes. She had spent her life learning to find peace in silence. The lights dimmed a little as the announcer walked onto the stage. The sound of applause filled the room. The man smiled proudly and spoke into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our annual Winter Piano Gala. Tonight we celebrate music, talent, and passion." The crowd clapped again, the sound echoing warmly through the hall. One by one, the performers took the stage. Each pianist wore a stunning outfit and performed with practiced confidence. The audience applauded politely after every performance. Some pieces were technically impressive, others were emotional. But the mood in the room felt predictable, almost rehearsed. Meanwhile, the modest woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She watched each performance with calm eyes. She wasn't nervous, but there was a quiet tension in her posture, like a candle waiting to be lit. As the night went on, the audience began to grow slightly restless. Many had been sitting for hours, and though the performances were good, nothing had truly surprised them yet. The famous names had all performed. The crowd began to whisper among themselves, some preparing to leave early. That's when the announcer returned to the stage once more. "Our final performer for the evening," he began, his tone polite but not particularly excited, "is Ms. Clara Bennett." A few people looked at their programs, searching for the name. Some frowned slightly as they hadn't heard of her before. "Who's that?" one man whispered to his wife. "I don't know," she said with a shrug. "Maybe one of the amateurs?" The announcer continued, "She'll be performing her original arrangement of Moonlight Journey. Please give her a warm welcome." The applause that followed was light and scattered. A few polite claps echoed across the hall, but most people were already half distracted, expecting an ordinary closing performance. The modest woman, Clara, rose from her seat. Her steps were unhurried, and her gaze stayed low as she made her way toward the stage. Her beige dress moved softly with each step, and her simple shoes made almost no sound on the polished floor. Up close, the stage looked larger than ever. The lights above were bright, and for a moment they almost blinded her. But she didn't mind. She had dreamed of moments like this since she was a child, sitting beside an old upright piano in a small apartment where every note seemed to echo through the walls. She reached the piano and paused. The seat was slightly too high, so she adjusted it carefully. Her movements were slow, thoughtful, almost ritualistic. The crowd murmured quietly. Someone in the front row leaned to another and whispered, "I hope she knows what she's doing." The host, standing off to the side, gave her a polite smile, the kind reserved for newcomers who are not expected to impress. Clara simply nodded back. For a brief second, she looked out at the audience. Rows upon rows of faces stared back, some curious, some bored, some already half-turned toward the exit doors. She could feel the weight of their judgment without a single word being spoken. But inside, she wasn't angry. She wasn't even nervous. She was calm, the kind of calm that comes from years of playing when no one is watching. Her world had always been built around music. Not fame, not recognition, just pure connection. She took a slow breath. Her fingers brushed the smooth keys, and she closed her eyes for a moment as if greeting an old friend. The room was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes before something unknown. No one expected much, and yet, without realizing it, every head began to turn toward her. Something about her stillness drew attention, the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything. She opened her eyes again, and for a split second her lips curved into a faint, almost secret smile. No one knew yet that this moment, this quiet, easily overlooked moment, would change the night completely. The hall was still for a moment as the woman sat at the piano. Her hands rested gently on her lap while she waited for the quiet to settle. But not everyone in the audience was paying attention. In the back rows, a few people whispered to one another. Some checked their phones. Others yawned quietly behind their programs. To them, she was just another performer, a filler at the end of a long night. Near the front, a man in a dark suit leaned toward his friend. "She doesn't look like she belongs here," he murmured with a grin. His friend chuckled softly. "Probably a student performer. Maybe they added her to make the schedule longer." A few people nearby overheard and smirked. Their quiet laughter echoed faintly across the hall, though not enough for her to hear. Still, their tone carried the kind of arrogance that always hung in places like this, a belief that talent had to be dressed in silk and confidence. On stage, she adjusted the bench again, careful not to make a sound. The piano's lid reflected her face under the stage lights. Her expression was calm, almost serene. She looked fragile, like someone who could be easily overlooked. But her eyes held something deeper, a quiet strength, hidden yet unshakable. From where she sat, she could see the crowd, the judges, the musicians, the critics with pens in their hands. Some were already scribbling notes as if they'd made up their minds before she even played a single note. She noticed one of the well-known pianists sitting in the second row, arms crossed, his chin slightly lifted. He was the kind of man who lived for applause and attention, the kind who measured worth by the size of the audience cheering his name. When he looked at her, it wasn't with curiosity. It was pity. He tilted his head and whispered something to the woman next to him, who smiled politely but didn't respond. The man chuckled quietly, shaking his head as if he already knew how this performance would go. The woman at the piano didn't react. She kept her focus on the keys in front of her. For her, this wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It never had been. She was there because music was her language, the only one that had ever made sense when words failed her. But the audience didn't know that. They only saw what was on the surface, the plain dress, the nervous stillness, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention. They didn't see the years she had spent practicing in the quiet hours of the night, after work when the city was asleep. They didn't see the calluses on her fingertips or the worn-out piano in her small apartment that had taught her every note by heart. The announcer, standing just off stage, shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected the mood to dip so quickly. Earlier performers had walked up with charisma, bowing proudly and greeting the audience. But this woman hadn't said a word. She hadn't even looked up to acknowledge the crowd. She simply sat there waiting for something unseen, a rhythm only she could feel. The silence stretched. Some in the audience began to fidget, wondering if something was wrong. A few people coughed softly, filling the space with impatience. Finally, The announcer cleared his throat and said quietly, "You may begin when ready." She gave the slightest nod. Her fingers lifted from her lap and hovered above the keys. For a moment the light caught her hands, slender, graceful, yet marked by the years. Every wrinkle seemed to tell a story, every movement guided by memory rather than thought. She pressed a single key. The note rang out. Soft but pure, it lingered in the air longer than expected, as if it had a life of its own. And in that instant something shifted, not in the music, not yet, but in the air itself. The chatter faded. The room began to quiet down slowly, almost unconsciously. But before she continued, the sound of laughter interrupted. From the side of the stage, one of the younger assistants accidentally dropped a stack of programs. The papers scattered across the floor, and a small burst of laughter rippled through the audience. It wasn't directed at her, not directly, but it broke the fragile focus that had just begun to form. She paused, her fingers still resting on the piano keys. Then, instead of reacting, she smiled faintly and waited until the noise passed. It was a soft, knowing smile, the kind that said she'd seen this before. People often underestimated her, and she had learned long ago that silence could be stronger than anger. When the room quieted again, she took a deep breath and began to play once more. The first few bars were simple, slow, almost too slow for some. A man near the back whispered, "It sounds like a beginner's piece." But the melody began to unfold, revealing tiny details hidden beneath the surface. Each note carried warmth, each pause carried meaning. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply telling a story, her story, through sound. At first, the audience didn't understand. They weren't used to music that required patience. They were used to quick brilliance, loud moments, and flashy displays of skill. But her music didn't shout. It whispered. It drew people in one breath at a time. As the melody grew, a few heads began to turn. The same critics who had been writing notes now found their pens still. Something about the sound felt different. It wasn't perfect in a mechanical way, but it felt alive. Meanwhile, the proud pianist in the front row leaned back, crossing his legs. "She's not bad," he said softly. "But this isn't competition-level performance." His friend nodded in agreement. Too emotional. No precision. They didn't realize that those small imperfections were what made it human. The tiny hesitations between notes, the gentle press of her hands, the slight tremble in the melody. They weren't mistakes. They were feelings. Real ones. But even as she played, there were still people who didn't see it. Some continued to whisper, others looked away. They couldn't see past her modesty, her simplicity, her calmness. They had already decided that she was ordinary, and in their minds nothing extraordinary could come from someone ordinary. Yet on stage, she remained composed. Every movement she made was careful and deliberate. Her breathing matched the rhythm of the song. Her eyes stayed half closed, as if the music was guiding her through memories she had never spoken aloud. When the piece began to rise, something remarkable happened. A small boy sitting in the front row, no older than 8, leaned forward, completely still. His mother tried to whisper something to him, but he didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the pianist's hands, watching as they danced across the keys. He didn't know much about music, but he could feel something, a warmth, a story, a heartbeat. And slowly, others began to feel it too. The whispers started to fade. The smirk softened. Even the proud pianist who had been judging her a few minutes earlier found himself watching more intently. There was something in the way she played, something that words couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just skill, it was truth. She reached a softer passage, and the sound melted into a kind of stillness that wrapped around the room. The audience stopped shifting in their seats. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The announcer at the side of the stage, who had earlier looked impatient, now stood completely frozen. He couldn't look away. The woman at the piano was no longer just a performer, she was transforming the space. Her music seemed to reach places words couldn't reach. It carried something deeply personal, something that came from years of quiet persistence and unseen effort. And yet, even now, there were those who couldn't accept it. Some critics in the back whispered that her piece lacked structure, that it was too emotional, too personal, too simple. But the ones truly listening, really listening, were beginning to understand. They could hear her heart between the notes. By the time she reached the middle of her performance, the hall had changed completely. The same people who had once ignored her were now drawn in, though most didn't realize it yet. Something about her calmness had taken hold of them. As she played, her face softened. She wasn't smiling, but there was peace there. The kind of peace that comes from finally being heard, even if only for a moment. The proud pianist in the second row leaned forward now. His eyes followed her hands carefully. His earlier confidence had faded into quiet interest. He didn't know it yet, but in the next few minutes, everything he thought he knew about music and about people was about to change. And as her fingers began to move faster, the room prepared itself for something it didn't expect. The quiet woman no one noticed at first was about to remind them that greatness doesn't need to announce itself. It simply needs to be felt. The soft melody continued to rise, gently at first, like a quiet stream finding its way through stones. Then, little by little, it began to grow and fuller, richer, more alive. Every note seemed to carry something personal, something that came from a place beyond skill or technique. The woman's eyes were half closed, her expression calm but focused. Her hands moved with a confidence that didn't shout for attention. They spoke with grace and truth. Each motion felt natural, like breathing. The piano no longer looked like an instrument. It looked like an extension of her heart. The audience sat still. The ones who had once whispered now found themselves silent, watching her closely. No one had expected this. Her playing wasn't just music. It was a story. You could feel that she wasn't performing for applause. She was reliving something. Her fingers glided across the keys, weaving together sounds that felt like memories. There were moments of sadness, brief flashes of joy, and soft pauses that carried the weight of 1,000 quiet nights. The sound filled the entire hall, yet it felt deeply personal, like she was speaking directly to each listener. Even the proud pianist in the second row, who had been so sure of his own greatness, couldn't look away. At first, he tried to keep his composure, but his eyes betrayed him. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, studying her movements carefully. The longer he watched, the more he realized something he didn't want to admit. She was better than him. Not in showmanship or fame, but in feeling. Her music had soul. She didn't need dramatic gestures or exaggerated expressions. The emotion came naturally through the sound itself. Every note carried purpose. Every pause meant something. The music wasn't loud or fast, but it made hearts race in ways no technical performance could. A hush had fallen over the room. Even the smallest sounds, as the rustle of a coat, a breath, a faint cough, seemed to vanish. The audience was wrapped inside the music. For a moment, the lights above shimmered softly against the black surface of the piano, creating reflections that danced across her hands. The hall felt timeless, like the world outside had stopped turning. The melody shifted again, gentle at first, then blooming into something powerful. It was as if her soul had finally opened. The notes were no longer careful. They were free. Some people in the audience began to tear up without realizing why. The emotions in the music weren't obvious or forced. They came like a whisper from somewhere deep inside her. It was the kind of sound that reminded people of their own hidden stories, of losses, dreams, love, and moments that had long faded, but never disappeared completely. The woman didn't look at the audience. She didn't need to. Her world was in front of her, in the piano, in the rhythm that carried her away. Her breathing followed the flow of the piece, steady when it was calm, deep when it rose in passion. When she reached a delicate section of the piece, her hands moved so lightly that the notes almost floated in the air. They seemed to shimmer, fragile and pure, like morning light touching water. The sound made the audience lean forward unconsciously, as if afraid to miss even a single moment. The judges, who had spent the night scribbling in their notebooks, now sat motionless. Their pens had stopped. They didn't know what to write. The performance was no longer about skill or score. It was about emotion, something you couldn't measure or grade. One of them, an older man with silver hair, exhaled deeply, his eyes glistening. He had judged hundreds of pianists in his life, seen countless competitions and recitals, but something about this woman's playing reminded him of why he fell in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. Her piece moved into its middle section, soft, warm, and tender. It felt like a quiet conversation between her and the piano, one that only they could understand. The melody was filled with longing, yet it carried peace. At that moment, the proud pianist in the front row shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. He whispered, "She's incredible." His voice was barely audible, but the person next to him heard and simply nodded. There was no need for more words. The audience remained completely still. You could almost hear the sound of hearts beating in the silence between notes. Even the faintest breath seemed loud in comparison. Then came the part no one expected, the transition. The melody shifted again, turning darker for a brief moment. The warmth faded, replaced by something haunting, something that carried pain. It wasn't harsh, but it was deep, like remembering something you thought you'd forgotten. Her playing grew more intense, but never wild. Every note was controlled, yet filled with emotion that seemed too large for the room to contain. Some people looked at one another, moved but unsure why. The woman's story was being told without words, and though no one knew her personally, they could all feel it, the struggle, the loneliness, the quiet strength that had brought her here. Her hands began to move faster now. The melody swelled into a storm of emotion, rising and falling like waves. Each movement carried weight and purpose, but nothing felt forced. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was expressing something that had lived inside her for years. It was passion, pain, love, and hope, and all at once. The room, once filled with judgment and whispers, was now united in silence. People who had come expecting routine performances found themselves caught in a story they didn't want to end. Even the critics in the back, the ones known for their cold reviews, sat upright, watching her closely. One of them slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. He didn't bother hiding it. As the music reached its height, the woman's entire body seemed to move with it. Not dramatically, not for show, but naturally, like a tree swaying with the wind. Her hair brushed lightly against her shoulders as she played, and her face showed the faintest trace of emotion, a mix of sorrow and relief. Then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the music softened again. It became fragile, quiet, almost like a whisper. The storm faded into calm. The notes that followed were gentle, pure, almost like a lullaby. The audience held their breath. One by one, her fingers slowed. Each note carried the kind of beauty that only comes from honesty. You could hear everything in it. Her journey, her solitude, her quiet strength. In that silence between sounds, the truth became clear. This wasn't just a recital. It was a confession. A piece of her soul was unfolding before them. A woman in the audience pressed a hand to her chest. A man beside her closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. People who had come to judge were now simply listening, really listening. The proud pianist, the critics, the guests. They all looked the same now. Humbled, moved, speechless, and through it all, the modest woman remained calm. Her hands kept playing, her face peaceful. She wasn't aware of how many people she had touched in that moment. She wasn't thinking about applause or recognition. She was somewhere far away, in the memory of an old piano, in the echo of nights spent alone with music that no one else heard. The final section began softly. It wasn't grand or loud when it was tender, like a goodbye. Each note faded gently into the next, carrying with it a quiet grace. Her last chord rang out like a sigh, lingering in the air before fading into silence, and then nothing. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The hall was completely still. It was as if everyone was afraid to break the moment. The sound of that final note seemed to echo in their hearts. Her hands remained on the keys for a few seconds longer, before she lifted them slowly. She looked at the piano, then at the audience. Her eyes met theirs, not in pride, but in gratitude. She gave a small, humble bow. Still no one clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't yet. They were still lost in what they had just heard. It took a few breaths, a few quiet seconds before someone finally stood and began to applaud. The sound grew quickly, from a few claps to a wave of thunderous applause that filled the hall. People rose from their seats cheering, crying, shouting her name. The same people who had once ignored her were now standing, unable to stop clapping. She smiled softly, almost shyly, and bowed again. There were no words she could say that would add anything to what she had already expressed. The music had said it all, in that moment, Everyone in that hall, from the judges to the proud pianist to the smallest child in the front row, knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. And as she walked off the stage, quietly and gracefully, the applause followed her like a wave. No one would forget that night, not because of the fame, not because of the perfection, but because one modest woman, ignored and underestimated, had reminded everyone what true beauty sounds like when it comes from the heart. For several long moments after she left the stage, the applause continued to fill the hall. It wasn't just polite clapping anymore, and it was raw emotion, the kind that comes when people feel something real. Many were still standing, cheering through tears, trying to hold on to the feeling her music had left behind. The announcer, who had earlier introduced her without much enthusiasm, stood frozen near the curtain. He looked stunned, blinking as though he had just seen something unreal. When he finally stepped forward to speak, his voice trembled slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "let's give one more round of applause for the incredible performance you just witnessed." The audience responded instantly. The sound was even louder this time, a wave of appreciation that seemed to shake the room. Behind the stage, the modest woman stood quietly near the dressing area. The sound of applause reached her, echoing through the corridors. She didn't rush back to take another bow. She just closed her eyes for a second, breathing slowly, letting the moment sink in. She wasn't thinking about victory or fame. What she felt was something deeper, a quiet sense of peace. After years of being unnoticed, overlooked, and doubted, she had finally spoken the only way she knew how, through her music. One of the assistants rushed toward her, eyes wide. That was unbelievable," he said, struggling to find the right words. "The judges and everyone, they're still talking about it." She smiled kindly, her voice calm. "Thank you," she said. "I'm glad they listened." He nodded quickly, still a little breathless. "Listened? They didn't just listen. You changed the whole room. Nobody expected that." She gave a gentle laugh, more out of humility than pride. "Sometimes," she said, "people don't expect much from someone who looks ordinary. That's all right. It makes the surprise sweeter." Out in the hall, people were buzzing with conversation. The change in the room was almost unreal. The same audience that had whispered and doubted her before was now filled with admiration. A woman in the second row wiped her eyes and said to her husband, "I've never heard anything like that." It felt like she was telling my story through her music. Her husband nodded slowly, still lost in thought. "She didn't play like she wanted to impress," he said quietly. "She played like she wanted to heal." Nearby, one of the young musicians who had laughed earlier sat in silence. He looked at the empty stage, embarrassed. The sound of her playing still echoed in his mind. "I shouldn't have judged her," he muttered. His friend nodded but said nothing. They both felt a quiet shame they couldn't quite put into words. Even the critics were shaken. One of them, a man known for being harsh and cold in his reviews, sat holding his pen without moving. He had written only 2 words on his notepad, "Pure soul." He couldn't think of anything else to say. The proud pianist, the one who had mocked her before, was perhaps the most affected of all. He hadn't moved since the applause began. His eyes were fixed on the piano, as if the instrument itself had betrayed him by revealing something he didn't understand. His friend leaned closer. "You all right?" he whispered. The man didn't answer right away. After a long silence, he said softly, "I've spent years chasing perfection, and she just showed me what I've been missing." His voice was heavy, filled with something close to regret. Meanwhile, the announcer walked backstage again, hoping to find the woman and bring her out once more. But when he reached the hallway, she wasn't there. The assistant pointed toward the exit. "She left quietly," he said. "She didn't want attention." The announcer blinked. "She left?" The assistant nodded. "She said the music was enough." Out in the cold night air, the modest woman stepped down the same side stairs she had used to enter. The sound of applause still echoed faintly behind her, but she didn't turn around. The sky was clear now, stars scattered above the city lights. She walked slowly, her old leather bag hanging over her shoulder. Her steps were light, but her heart was full. The chill of the air brushed against her face, but she didn't mind. It reminded her she was alive, truly alive, in a way she hadn't felt for years. She passed a small cafe on the corner where a few people from the audience were gathered. They were still talking about her performance. She smiled faintly as she heard bits of their conversation. Who was she? one asked. I've never seen her name before. No idea, another replied. But I'll never forget that sound. She kept walking, her expression thoughtful. She didn't need them to know her name. What mattered was that they had felt something real. Inside the concert hall, the judges were still in discussion. One of them, the older man with silver hair, finally spoke. In all my years, he said slowly, I've rarely seen an audience move like that. That woman's music wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. She reminded us what music is supposed to do. The others nodded in agreement. One of them added, we must find her. The world needs to hear her again. But they wouldn't find her easily. She wasn't someone who lived for fame or awards. She had come, played her heart out, and left quietly, the same way she arrived. Hours later, when the hall had emptied and the lights were dimmed, the staff began cleaning the stage. One of them noticed something small left near the piano bench, a single folded piece of paper. He picked it up and handed it to the event manager. The paper was old and creased with simple handwriting on it. It read, "Thank you for letting me play, no signature, no contact information." Just those words. The manager smiled softly. She really didn't want anything in return, he said. By the next morning, word of her performance had already begun to spread. Videos recorded by audience members appeared online. People shared them, writing comments filled with emotion. Who is she? I've never felt this way from music before. This isn't performance, and it's magic. Even people who hadn't been there could feel it through the screen. The video of her playing was quiet, without special effects or perfect lighting, yet it touched hearts everywhere. Music schools began showing the clip to their students. Some teachers said, "This is what it means to play with soul. Remember this." In the days that followed, the proud pianist tried to go back to his usual routine, but something had changed inside him. Every time he sat at his piano, her melody came back to him. It haunted him, not in a painful way, but in a humbling one. He realized that for all his success, he had forgotten why he started playing in the first place. He had been chasing praise, trophies, and headlines. She had been chasing truth, and she found it. Back in her small apartment, the modest woman sat by her old upright piano. The keys were slightly yellowed, and a few made soft clicking sounds, but to her it was still beautiful. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, not to practice, not to prepare for anything, just to feel the music again. She played quietly, the sound filling the tiny room. This was her true home. Not the grand stage, not the bright lights, but this small space where music had always been her closest friend. As she played, a faint smile touched her lips. She thought about the faces she had seen that night, the surprise, the silence, the awe. She didn't need their applause anymore. What mattered was that for a brief moment she had shared something real with them, something honest. The world outside moved on quickly, new concerts, new stars, new trends. But those who had been there that night never forgot her. Even years later, people still spoke about the woman who silenced the hall. Some said she was a teacher who had given up her career. Others believed she was a hidden prodigy who had once walked away from fame. No one ever knew the full truth, and maybe that was how she wanted it. For her, music was never about being seen. It was about being felt. And that night, she had done exactly that. She had reminded everyone that beauty doesn't always come dressed in perfection or fame. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits at a piano, and lets a single note speak for itself. When she finally stopped playing that night in her small room, she looked out the window. The city lights glowed softly in the distance. She whispered to herself, that was enough. Then she closed the lid of her piano gently, as though tucking a story to rest, one that would live on forever in the hearts of those who had heard it. Months had passed since that unforgettable night. The concert hall had hosted dozens of new performances since then. New faces, new talents, new stories. But none had quite erased the memory of that quiet woman who had once walked onto the stage, played her heart out, and disappeared without a trace. People still spoke of her, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in awe. The video of her performance had spread far beyond the city, reaching countries she'd never even visited. Millions had watched it online. They didn't know her name or her story. All they knew was the feeling her music left behind. It was the kind of melody that stayed with you. Not because of the notes, but because of the truth it carried. One morning, an old music teacher sat at his desk watching that same video again. His eyes filled with tears as he listened. He turned to his students who stood quietly beside him. "Listen to this," he said softly. "She doesn't play for attention. She plays for meaning. That's what music is, not showing off but speaking to the soul." The students nodded silently. Some of them had been struggling with pressure, the need to be perfect, to win competitions, to please others. But watching that video changed something in them. They began to understand that real music wasn't about applause. It was about honesty. In another part of the city, a young pianist who had been at that recital was sitting by his window. He had once been proud, even arrogant, but ever since that night he had been different. Her playing had humbled him. He practiced every day now, but with a new purpose. He didn't care as much about being the fastest or the loudest. He wanted to find the emotion she had shown, the quiet power behind every note. Sometimes he would close his eyes while playing and imagine her there, the calm woman who had silenced the hall. He could still remember her expression as she played, peaceful, focused, lost in the moment. One evening, he sat at his piano and whispered to himself, "Wherever you are, thank you." And he played the melody she had created, note by note, until tears filled his eyes. The effect of her performance reached far and wide. People who had long stopped believing in art, in sincerity, in beauty, began to feel it again. Her music had touched something buried deep inside them. News channels even mentioned her story. Reporters called her the unknown virtuoso. They interviewed people who had been at the concert, asking if anyone knew her name. But no one did. One of the staff members recalled how she had left a note that simply said, "Thank you for letting me play." That single sentence became famous, shared in posts, written in articles, even printed on posters. Those 7 words carried a strange power. They showed humility, gratitude, and love, in a world that was often full of noise and ego. While the world kept searching for her, the woman herself continued her quiet life in a small town not far from the city. She didn't own a television or use social media. She didn't know her video had gone viral. She simply lived as she always had, teaching piano to children, helping them discover the beauty of sound. Her students adored her, though most didn't realize who she really was. To them, she was just their kind, soft-spoken teacher who smiled when they made mistakes and always said, "Try to feel the music, not fight it." She never talked about the recital. Not once. She didn't need to. The music had already spoken for her. One rainy afternoon, she sat at her piano watching the raindrops slide down the window. The air smelled fresh and earthy. Her cat slept curled up near her feet. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play softly. The melody was new, gentle and slow, like a conversation between the rain and her heart. Outside, a passerby stopped under her window, listening. The sound floated through the open air, fragile, beautiful, alive. For a few minutes, time seemed to stop. When she finished, she sighed softly. She didn't know that someone had recorded that moment on their phone. That simple recording, her playing while it rained, would later spread again, reminding people that beauty could exist in the smallest corners of life. Back in the city, the concert hall decided to dedicate a night to her memory, even though they didn't know if she was still alive. They called it The Woman Who Played from the Heart. The proud pianist, now humbler and wiser, volunteered to perform that evening. When he took the stage, he didn't speak to the audience. He just placed a small white flower on the piano, a quiet tribute, and began to play her melody. As the first notes filled the hall, people grew still. Some closed their eyes. The music carried the same quiet strength it had that unforgettable night, full of emotion, honesty, and light. Halfway through the performance, the pianist paused, overcome with emotion. He whispered softly, "Wherever you are, thank you for reminding us what music truly means." When the piece ended, there was silence. Not out of politeness, but out of reverence. Nobody wanted to break the spell. Later that night, when he stepped outside into the cool air, he saw an old woman sitting on a bench across the street. She was wearing a simple gray coat, her hair tucked neatly behind her ears. There was something strangely familiar about her posture. For a moment he thought, could it be her? But when he blinked, she was gone. Only the empty bench remained, glistening under the streetlight. He smiled faintly to himself. Maybe she was never meant to be found, he whispered, and somehow that felt right. The story of the modest woman became something like a legend. Her video continued to circulate online, inspiring people across generations. Young musicians, teachers, and even those who had never touched a piano watched it and found comfort in her calm strength. Some called her the invisible teacher. Others said she was a reminder that true talent doesn't shout, it whispers, and yet it reaches the deepest parts of us. Years later, one of her young students, a shy little girl she had taught in her small town, grew up to become a concert pianist herself. During her first big performance, reporters asked her who inspired her the most. The young woman smiled and said, "My teacher. She taught me that music isn't about showing off. It's about being honest. She once told me that the piano speaks when the heart listens." After the concert, she visited her teacher's small home. The older woman was sitting by the same window, knitting quietly. When she saw her former student, her eyes lit up with warmth. "You played beautifully," she said softly. The young woman blushed. "I learned from you," she replied. "I only hope I can make people feel the way you did that night." The teacher smiled gently. "It doesn't matter how many people listen. What matters is if one person feels something true." The two of them sat together for a long time, the sound of rain tapping softly outside. Before leaving, the young pianist turned and said, "Do you ever miss the stage?" The older woman shook her head with a faint laugh. "No, I don't need the stage. The music never leaves me." As the years went by, her name still remained unknown to the world. But her music, her message, continued to live on through others. One winter morning, long after she had passed peacefully in her sleep, her students gathered at her small home. They found her piano still standing by the window. On it was a single sheet of paper written in her neat handwriting. It said, "If you play with your heart, someone somewhere will listen, even if you never meet them." That note became a treasure among her students. They framed it and kept it at the local music school she had helped build. Every year they held a small concert in her memory. No one wore fancy clothes and no one competed. They just played with sincerity, with emotion, with heart, and somewhere, perhaps beyond time and sound, the modest woman who had once silenced a hall smiled, knowing her music had never truly stopped. It had simply changed hands, finding new hearts to live in, because real music never fades. It doesn't belong to fame or to one person. It belongs to the moments when silence turns into something beautiful, something true. And so, the legend of the modest woman at the piano lived on, not in grand halls or shiny awards, but in every quiet corner where someone sat alone at a piano and dared to feel.